Uh, Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining my session today. My name is Mohamed Wali. I work as a solutions architect for AWS Solutions Architecture team, mainly acting as a technical advisor for large enterprises and retail customers within Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, based out of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. So it was a heck of a kind of long flight for me, still quite jet lagged, but very excited to be in Chicago today. So today I'm going to talk about the AWS Security Reference Architecture. But before getting started, I have a confession to make. This is not like a level 400, level 300 session. We only have a 30 minutes time slot via which we're going to introduce the solution, how to use it, what kind of benefits it brings. So if that's not what you were looking for, if you think another breakout session can be more efficient for the sake of your time, please feel free to join it. So with that said, I'm quite curious to know if any of you is already familiar with AWS Security Services and has used at least one or more AWS Security Service before. Please continue raising your hand if you have used 3 or more security services. All right, that's still 50%. 5 or more? 10 or more? All right, so pretty much at least the majority are quite familiar with the different, or at least 3 or more security services on AWS. So for those who are not familiar with the full stack, actually, throughout the session, whenever I refer to any of the security services, I would quickly introduce what it is so you get some sort of a grasp about what is it. So what we're going to talk about today, first off, I'll introduce the AWS Security Reference Architecture, which I will abbreviate as AWS SRA most of the time, what it is, why you should use it, and why you actually build it at the first place. And for the sake of the session time, we'll not really be able to go through every single trench of the solution. Therefore, I was focused more on the highlights of the solution. And last but not least, we'd have some time to walk through the code repository and the documents used to implement this architecture eventually. So AWS SRA, what is it? It's simply a holistic set of guidelines for deploying the full complement of AWS security services in a multi-account environment. And this can be quite useful really when it comes to designing, implementing, and even managing your different AWS security services on AWS while making sure that they are aligning with the recommended best practices. So these recommendations are built around the single page architecture that you can see on the left side here, which pretty much includes different accounts and different OUs with many security services running within them, mainly elaborating like where exactly should be deploying these different security services and how they would be interacting together, and more importantly, how it can help you to achieve your security objectives. So the accompanying architecture and the recommendations are mainly based on our real-world experience with certain enterprise customers that we started off the solution with until we open sourced it at some point. And it's written down in a document which is actually published in AWS Prescriptive Guidance, which I'm going to share its URL with you later on. So this solution or this document is meant to be used as a reference for you to deploy this comprehensive set of AWS security services if you would like to secure a multi-account environment. On top of that, we have the AWS SRA code repository, which you can see on the down right side, which pretty much includes some infrastructure as code modules that can really help you to get started to deploy this distribution, so you don't really have to reinvent the wheel. Why did we build it at all? What was the motive? So pretty much throughout our discussions with the customers, we got to hear that they were quite happy with the fact that we are always publishing some best practices, making sure our documentation is always up to date, covering many security services in different blog posts, or maybe even how to integrate 1 or 2 of these services. But what they really missed was, all right, I have a lot of security services. I need to fill the gap of making sure that how can I have pretty much a helicopter overview about the full security stack and how they can work together. And more importantly, where to deploy them in order to make efficient use, because by the end of the day, in a multi-account environment, you have many, and you still, for an architecture reasons, you would like to make sure that they are deployed in the most efficient manner. And eventually that should help you to achieve your security objectives. So these were kind of, some sort of the conversations we had at the beginning with the customers, why we actually come up with this solution eventually. So with that, how can it really help you? How you can get benefited from the solution? So the AWS SRA can help you, depends on actually where you are in your cloud adoption journey. So can really help you to define the target state for your own security architecture if you're fairly getting started with a few set of accounts, or even if you already have a well-established AWS environment, you can actually use AWS SRA to help you define this kind of security architecture environment, customize it to meet your requirements while also utilizing the solution, so on and so forth. But what if even you already have your own security architecture? In this case, you can actually use the AWS SRA as some sort of a reference that you can review your existing security architecture against it. And by assessing what you have against it, you can be more confident that if things are quite similar, then you're more confident about that the choices you have chosen are actually aligned with what we normally recommend. And if it diverges from the AWS SRA, which can happen, well, at least it can raise some sort of a flag that maybe you need to review the design decision process that came up with the way you are doing things. By the end of the day, there could be actually some legitimate reasons for why you might diverge from the AWS SRA, maybe, for example, to meet some certain industry requirement or so. Once you decide to proceed with the solution, I can imagine that the most tough thing is really to go ahead and implement it. And that's why we have open sourced the solution, or some of the solution examples that you can use to bootstrap your environment, so you really don't have to reinvent the wheel. So in the AWS SRA code repository, you can see the different infrastructure as code modules that you can really use to deploy different security services, either on the account level or pretty much on the whole organization level. Throughout your journey with AWS SRA, you would actually get to learn more about the different security services and capabilities. Because in the documentation that I will refer to you by the end of the session, it actually covers different considerations and caveats you need to watch out for when you are integrating pretty much all of these services. So that would kind of upskill your knowledge about AWS security, especially if you're not 100% security specialist, while also having this kind of high-level introduction through the depths of the different AWS security services. You would be more familiar about what kind of functionalities every service is offering. And last but not least, it can help you to drive a discussion about the organizational responsibility, when it really comes to security. And that's a key element really when it comes to coming up with a security architecture or security strategy, is really to understand who is responsible for what. So defining ownership is quite a key here. And for example, maybe one of the questions that would come up throughout this conversation is, where should I be really aggregating the security findings? And that also brings us a question of which team would be responsible for this activity. Another one could be, are all the findings would be managed by a centralized security team, or would every application team own their own security monitoring as well, which means they would also need further permissions over different AWS security services. So these are the kind of discussions you might be having, which can kind of help you to have a more clear overview about your security responsibilities within the organization. So with that, we got to know what is AWS SRA, a bit of history, like why did we build it in the first place, what kind of benefits it can bring to you. Now let's have a look at the architecture of the solution itself. So when we built the solution, we counted on these three frameworks as part of security foundation that we can build on. So we use the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework, we use the AWS Architect Framework, as well as the Shared Responsibility Model. So the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework, in case you're not familiar with it, it's mainly a framework made by AWS to help you leverage AWS experiences as well as best practices to accelerate your business digitalization on AWS Cloud and recognize the business value out of it. And it consists of 6 perspectives. One of these perspectives is about security. So it kind of guides you like how to implement the right security controls in order to eventually meet your regulatory requirements. And that's what we counted on, or what we took from the Cloud Adoption Framework. The same in the AWS Well-Architected Framework, which is simply a framework meant to help you to come up with pros and cons for choosing a certain decision when it really comes to architecting a workload in AWS. And it consists of 6 pillars as well. One of these pillars is about security, which kind of guides you how to assess and protect your data while you are designing your workload on AWS. And last but not least, the shared responsibility model, which is, we tend to say most of the time that security is a top priority at AWS, but still kind of a joint journey between ourselves and our customers. So when we talk about some services such as EC2 instances, for these, we do take the full responsibility when it comes to security from the facilities in which our services operate, all the way up to the operating system of the host in which your EC2 instance runs. Of course, this ownership can go more beyond that, depending on to what extent the managed service you are using has more stuff for AWS to own. But by the end of the day, as I mentioned, it's a joint journey. For example, if you create an S3 bucket, we do expect that, at least on your side as well, you would be blocking the public access, you would be encrypting your S3 bucket, so on and so forth. So as mentioned, this is actually what we counted on when it really comes to the security foundations of the solution. This is some sort of high-level account structure. As you see on the left side, we have an AWS organization within which we have different organizational units. And on these different OUs or organizational units, we have different accounts meant to achieve different purposes. So for an account structure perspective, we also counted on the concept of AWS organization, as well as a multi-account strategy, which you can find them in more details in the AWS documentation, covering the different types of organizational units you can create, the different accounts you can create, and what kind of purposes are behind this, so you can choose the type of your account, position it on the right OU in the most efficient way. And this was another thing that we really counted on while we were building the solution. So with that, I think you get a grasp of actually what AWS SRA. I've been talking a lot so far about, how cool it is. Now we can actually dive a little bit deeper into the solution. As you see in this architecture, it's a little hard to read, actually. We have a lot of accounts with too many services running in them. So let's actually take it an account by account to see what these accounts are doing and what are these security services are doing and interacting, how they are interacting with each other. So in this diagram is the security tooling account, which is part of the security OU. As part of the initial architecture that you saw in the previous slide, we do recommend that you have a security tooling account within a security OU. So you need to have that dedicated one. And it's kind of dedicated, for security, for operating security services, monitoring your security findings across your organization. That's what this account is meant for. That's why we have pretty much all of these different security services that can really help you to, achieve or help you to address different security requirements. So if we started with a service such as AWS Security Hub, this is kind of a service responsible to run automated checks for your AWS resources within your organization against certain regulatory frameworks, which could be CIS, for example. So this service not only assists your resources against these kind of frameworks, but also help you to build or pull the security findings from other different security services running within this account. So if we're talking about a service such as Amazon Guard Duty, which is meant to detect any malicious activities in your account or any suspicious behaviors, that can be eventually reported as a finding, and eventually Security Hub can hold this finding to centralize it in its own dashboard. The same applies for Amazon Macy, which is meant to be a data classification service and can help you to detect any sensitive information that you might have running in your S3 buckets. And I can imagine that there are some very strict compliance requirements when it comes to HIPAA or GDPR in Europe, for example, where you really shouldn't be storing any sensitive information in your S3 buckets, for example. That's where this service can help you with, and eventually the AWS Security Hub can pull these security findings and store it with the AWS Security Hub. The same applies for the other services that integrate with it. For example, AWS Config can help you to detect if there is any configuration changes for your resources that might put them in a non-compliant state other than the desired state you would like to see them in. So eventually, pretty much these services can report its security finding to Security Hub. And to take these findings further for troubleshooting, you can use Amazon Detective, which can help you to visualize your security finding, dive deep into it, get to know what is the root cause of this problem. And from there, you can actually start to address this problem. Eventually, the AWS Audit Manager can actually use pretty much all of these security findings to create some sort of an assessment reports that you can use for frequent auditing for your whole security landscape. So you get to know where you are in your journey to enhance your security posture in general. So this is the very first account that we do have. This is the kind of service you'd be having, and they run on the organization level. So they don't only get what you have in this account only, but pretty much they would be considered as a place to centralize the management of these security services, as well as the security findings storing in this account. Another account we have in the security OU is a log archive account, which is dedicated to ingesting and archiving all the security related logs and backups. So with centralized logs in place, actually you'll be able to set up something like, proper monitoring and auditing for your sensitive logs. So for example, if there is any unauthorized access to the S3 bucket in which you have your logs, or any IAM policy changes that maybe give some sort of privileged access to somebody, you can be notified and you'll be able to monitor your security logs all in one place. These security logs can be coming from different security services. So if we're talking about VPC flow logs or DNS logs, or even CloudTrail logs, which capture the API activities across your organization, that would be actually the place where you are storing and putting your logs in. As you see in the bottom, there are some services that we actually covered in the previous slide, but let's keep them there right now. I will tell you later on why you actually see them in pretty much all of the accounts that I would be walking you through today. Another account that we do recommend to have is the shared services account, which would be part of the infrastructure OU. And it's actually meant to operate your commonly used services that can be used and consumed by other accounts running in your environment. Think about something like Active Directory, for which you can use AWS Managed AD, which can be used by different Microsoft workloads running across different accounts. The same applies for messaging solutions and so on. So for a security perspective, it's highly recommended that you have this kind of account to store your different security services that can be consumed by others in. And that takes us to the last account that I'm going to talk about as part of the architecture, which is the application account. That's where you're actually running your applications. So pretty much I can imagine that you have many of those running in your workloads OU. And as you see in this diagram in particular, we don't only have security services, but also we do have other services which are not necessarily security related. So because that's where we are running our applications. So what I'm going to do for the sake of showing an example in this case, I have just have a 3-tier web application exposed via the application load balancer. The application runs in the EC2 instances and stores its data in the Amazon Aurora database. So you still can see other security related services, but that's more on the account level, such as Secrets Manager, which can act as a secrets management service, helps you to store your secrets, rotate your secrets. So if your application running on your EC2 instance would like to access the database, so storing the database connection string can actually happen in the AWS Secrets Manager, or if it tries to reach out another API for which it needs a token, that's where you can actually store it. And using the right IAM policies to restrict the access for it, the application would be able to retrieve the secrets from the AWS Secrets Manager, and eventually you will not have to hard code any secrets in your application code, which is against any best practice in general. Also, another service such as KMS can really help you to protect your data at rest. So thinking about protecting the APS volumes by encrypting them with KMS, and the same for the Amazon Aurora databases. So with that, let's really see how that can look like in a real world example. What you see is 3 orange boxes here, and I'm gonna walk from left to right, starting off with the AWS Systems Manager agent, which is quite an important service for security, mainly because via the AWS Systems Manager agent, you would be able to update your own EC2 instances on which your application is running. It can be used to establish SSH connections to your EC2 instances without having to expose the SSH port, because in this case, you can use Session Manager instead. It can actually also, or actually Amazon Inspector, which is a vulnerability assessment service that can help you to detect if there is any vulnerabilities or any unintended network exposure in your EC2 instances. Actually depends on the AWS Systems Manager agent itself. Moving to the second box, we can see that we have different endpoints for different AWS managed services, such as KMS, Systems Manager, so on and so forth. So these endpoints are applied on the VPC level, granting the resources running within this VPC direct access to these services via the backbone network of AWS. So you really don't have to go through the public internet if you need to communicate with these services. You don't have to establish any VPN connections, use transit gateway. By the end of the day, no complexity need to be introduced with such a basic type of communication. And that's why we do recommend also on the VPC level to use the VPC endpoints. We can even go farther with it, where we can set some security groups to restrict access to these endpoints. to make sure that it should accept traffic only from the right resources. This case could be only the EC2 instances. And we can even set some sort of endpoint policies that would restrict the access to the different principals running within your account. So maybe you would say that only an EC2 instance with an IAM profile with these permissions would be able to access it and have this kind of permissions that can execute against the service it tries to communicate with eventually. All the way to the right, where we can see the last box, we are having different security services that we have quickly covered in the very first account, the security tooling account. So what you see over here is the very same services, and that's mainly because what we saw earlier was more on the organization-wide, but what you see here is more on the account level. These services are quite agnostic. They are not meant to be only deployed on the organization, but instead they can run on the account as well. So eventually the application team that has access to this account can check their security findings from these services, as well as the centralized service itself depends on these services to centralize all of the security findings coming from it as well. So with that, I really would like to take a quick pause to review what we just covered in the previous section. So what we did quickly was we just talked about the high-level account structure, what kind of accounts and what kind of OUs we have, and where exactly we should be placing the different AWS security services. So the last section here is I'm going to talk about how we can actually eventually apply these security services at different layers for a normal AWS environment. And that's how we see how an AWS environment looks like. You have an AWS organization. Within it, you have different organizational units. And within these OUs, you have another layer for the AWS account itself, which is considered by default some sort of a logical security boundary. That's why we do recommend to make sure that you have an AWS account purposed only for one reason, which is to run a certain workload, so you don't extend the footprint of the account itself. Network and content delivery is not necessarily a layer, but it's more a level that can support the workloads that you run on your AWS accounts, all the way to principals, which are represented by the identity pieces, down to the resources, which you need also to secure the access to these resources, making sure they are encrypted as well. So to quickly see how we are mapping these services, as you see on the AWS organization and the OU level, we have these kind of organization-wide services, thinking about something like AWS CloudTrail that you would like to apply across your whole organization. That's actually where you can, or that's the layer actually where you are positioning it. The same for the SCPs, which is the security control policies, can apply it on AWS organization, as well as the different organizational units to achieve different purposes or to restrict down the access. And when we move one more layer to the AWS account, we can see that we have also still some of the similar services we saw on the OU, but these ones, as I mentioned earlier, are more of account agnostic. They don't necessarily have to run on a single account over the other or be deployed only on the organization level. In fact, they can be deployed on the organization level as well as the account level, together with some other services that you can utilize, such as Secrets Manager, KMS, which I talked about earlier. And then moving to the network and content delivery, that's where you can actually see the different network security services, such as AWS Firewall Manager, which can help you to set up some sort of a baseline for your security groups, for your web rules, so on and so forth. AWS Shield, which can help you to protect your workloads against DDoS attacks, together with other security services, such as the VPC endpoints that I covered earlier on. Moving to the principles, that's where you control your identity. So you're making sure that you're applying the least privilege approach, you're restricting down the access, you're setting up sessions, you're setting up some permission boundaries, so no one in a certain account can go over what you initially set for them, so you prevent privileged escalations, all the way down to the resource itself, which you still need to restrict the access by using the policies with these resources, as well as utilizing other services such as config to detect if any of these resources is not compliant with the desired state or not. So that's how actually we try to position the different things on different layers. So by the end of the day, you are having multiple layers of protection to make it quite hard for any intruder to reach your resources, which that's where actually your services and applications are running. Last but not least, I would quickly walk you through the AWS SRA code repository so you know what's already in there and how you can use it. These are some of the examples available in there. So you can actually implement pretty much all of these solutions organization-wide. Some of these solutions are account-wide as well, such as setting up IAM password policy on an account level, making sure S3 buckets are enabling the blocking the public access, so on and so forth. And this is how the repo looks like. It's meant to be self-service. Since we open sourced it, it's already very well explained. You can just go ahead, read what you already have in there, follow the deployment instructions, and you should be good to go. As I mentioned earlier, it's built from our own experience. So this is actually what we use to deploy for other customers. So it's meant to be high quality with a decent testing in place. And this is actually an example of what's included in the repo. So for every solution, that's what you would be seeing. Some sort of an architecture diagram telling you exactly how we are trying to implement this solution, giving you some resource description for every single resource used as part of this architecture and why it's there. And pretty much together with the deployment instruction that you need to follow in order to eventually implement this solution. And of course, it follows the least privilege. So when it comes to IAM rules and policies being used as part of the solutions, we are following the least privilege approach. Once you deploy them, you still can follow the post-deployment steps to verify that your deployment has gone successfully. So with that, I think we have run out of time, but please scan these QR codes to be navigated to the document of the solution, as well as a code repository for further information. I would be here wrangling around for the rest of the day. So in case you have any questions, please feel free to reach me out. So with that, I really would like to thank you for joining the session today. I hope you found it informative, and thank you so much.